This Memorial Day weekend, Americans across the country are paying $4.51 a gallon for regular gasoline, the highest pump price in 4 years. And this morning, something happened that could change that number very quickly. Trump posted on Truth Social that peace negotiations with Iran are proceeding in an orderly and constructive manner. Oil prices immediately dropped more than 5%. The Strait of Hormuz, closed since late February, may be about to reopen, and if it does, the single most important piece of leverage Canada had in the USMCA trade negotiation, which has a deadline of July 1st, 37 days from today, begins to disappear in real time. That is the story nobody is connecting this weekend. Iran peace talks are energy news. They are also, directly, a Canada-US trade war story. And the connection between those two things is why every American who has been filling up their tank since February needs to understand what is happening to the trade deal that governs North American commerce right now. Here's where it gets really interesting. When the US and Israel launched strikes against Iran on February the 28th, 2026, the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes, began shutting down. The International Energy Agency called it the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Brent crude surged from around $70 a barrel before the war to above $115 at its peak in early March. The national average for a gallon of gasoline rose from approximately $2.97 before the war to $4.51 today, according to AAA. That is a 51% increase in less than 3 months. Now here is what most people missed entirely. When Trump signed his tariff orders against Canada starting in February 2025, his trade team built the entire strategy around a single assumption: Canada needed the United States far more than the United States needed Canada. Jameson Greer, the U.S. trade representative, told congressional lawmakers that Canada and China were the only two countries that had economically retaliated against the United States, deliberately placing Canada in the same category as Washington's main geopolitical rival. The USMCA review deadline is July 1st. Trump's team was going into that review from a position of maximum pressure, with every public signal reinforcing Canada's dependency on the American market. Then Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, and the energy math changed overnight. Canada sold $111 billion worth of oil to the United States in 2024 alone. American refineries in the Midwest and Gulf Coast were modified at a cost of billions of dollars specifically to process Alberta heavy crude. 60% of all U.S. crude imports come from Canada. Think of it like this. You have a specialized factory that was built 30 years ago to process one specific type of raw material, a heavy, viscous grade that only comes from one place in the world. You cannot switch the factory to a different input. The machinery does not work that way. You would have to tear it out and rebuild from scratch. The refineries in Toledo, Ohio, and Whiting, Indiana, that were modified to handle Alberta bitumen are that factory. When Trump told Americans he had made the country energy independent, he was describing the production numbers accurately. What he was not describing was the refinery configuration. American shale fields produce light crude. American heavy crude refineries run on Alberta bitumen. Those are two separate systems. When the Strait of Hormuz closed and alternative sources of heavy crude became inaccessible, the refinery side of the equation became the only number that mattered. When Persian Gulf oil stopped flowing and the IEA declared a global supply emergency, that 60% became the most important number in North American trade, not because Ottawa had created it, but because Trump's own war had made it undeniable. Carleton University professor Fen Osler-Hampson, co-chair of the expert group on Canada-US relations, told the Canadian press in March that Washington was suddenly looking at its secure energy suppliers slightly differently, which was solely in tariff terms. Before Iran, Greer framed Canada as an adversary. After Iran, Canada was the crude oil pipeline that American refineries could not replace in weeks or months or probably years without a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure rebuild. This is where the conversation fundamentally changes. The Canada-US energy relationship did something specific during the Iran war that received almost no coverage in American media. As Persian Gulf oil stopped flowing to Asia, Canadian crude, moving through the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion to the Vancouver port, began filling that gap across the Pacific. For the first time ever, Canada's seaborne crude exports to China surpassed flows to the United States in April, according to commodity analyst Kay Peeler. Canada was not just supplying American refineries, Canada was helping American refineries export refined products to Asian buyers who could no longer access Persian Gulf oil. The chain of Canadian energy dependency ran deeper into the American system than any tariff document had acknowledged. Canadian government officials confirmed in April that the energy sector was being used explicitly as leverage in the CUSMA negotiations. Minister Dominic LeBlanc described the energy relationship as central to how Canada was framing the discussion with Washington. The Globe and Mail reported Canada making the case, quietly but directly, that American refinery infrastructure had been built around Alberta crude, and that rewriting that dependency was not a trade policy decision. It was a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar infrastructure rebuild that no political deadline could accelerate. There is a number from this week that puts the leverage question in its starkest form. As of Sunday morning, Brent crude stood at $97.94 a barrel, down roughly 9% from a month ago, but still up by more than a third from before the war began. That more than a third above pre-war levels is Canada's negotiating window expressed as a price. Every barrel of oil above $70 in the current environment is $1 of political pressure on Trump to keep Canadian energy relationships stable. When that premium compresses back towards 70, the political pressure compresses with it. The difference between $97 oil and $70 oil is not just a household expense story. It is the difference between a White House that needs Canada's stable supply and a White House that has options again. But here is the problem with all of that leverage. It is now evaporating in real time. On Saturday, Trump posted that the Iran deal was largely negotiated. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, speaking to reporters in New Delhi on Sunday, said there was a pretty solid thing on the table regarding Iran's ability to reopen the strait. CNN reported Sunday that Iranian officials had confirmed a memorandum of understanding was being finalized before broader nuclear talks within 30 to 60 days. J.P. Morgan analysts told CNN that if the strait reopens in early June, oil prices could average $97 a barrel through the rest of the year. Gasoline futures dropped more than 10% in a single session when ceasefire signals first appeared in April. The same mechanism is running again this weekend as Trump's peace signals hit the market, and Brent crude falls through $98 toward a potential floor below $90. There is another angle that almost nobody is talking about. When Trump wrote not to rush into a deal on Truth Social Sunday morning, that statement was reported in the press as diplomatic caution. It is not. It is a precision signal aimed at two audiences at once. The first audience is Iran, holding out for better terms on uranium enrichment and authority over the strait. The second audience is Canada, because every day oil prices stay elevated is a day American consumers feel the cost of the trade war, and a day the White House needs Canada's stable energy supply more than it is publicly admitting. Trump's calculation is visible in the calendar. The USMCA review deadline is July 1st. The midterms are in November. Close the Iran deal before July 1st, lower gas prices enough to neutralize the domestic political cost, and arrive at the USMCA table in a position of restored leverage over Canada, with Canadian energy no longer the irreplaceable asset it was in March and April. RBC economics data showed Canadian exports to non-U.S. economies were up 17% year over year in the 12 months to January 2026. Carney's diversification strategy was working, but the Iran premium that had been amplifying that strategy's leverage at the trade table was always temporary, and it is expiring faster than Ottawa had planned. Now here is where this starts affecting people who thought they were reading Memorial Day travel news. If you are driving to a cookout this afternoon in Ohio, Michigan, or Illinois, The trajectory of your gas price is connected in a direct line to a negotiation happening between Ottawa and Washington right now. AAA reported this Memorial Day as the most expensive travel weekend in 4 years. The Strait of Hormuz reopens in early June, and JP Morgan's $97 average estimate holds. Gas prices could fall from $4.51 toward $3.70 or lower by midsummer. A driver filling a 12-gallon tank every week would save roughly $10 per fill-up. That is real household money. But here is what that savings also represents. It is the disappearance of the political cost that has been keeping Trump from pushing Canada harder at the USMCA table. Every cent gas prices fall because of an Iran peace deal is a cent less urgency for the White House to keep Canadian energy stable, and a cent more room to press Canada on steel tariffs, aluminum duties, softwood lumber, and auto parts in the final weeks before July 1st. The structural reality does not change when oil prices fall. American refineries in the Midwest are still configured for Alberta crude. The 60% import dependency is still there. The pipeline network connecting Fort McMurray to Chicago and the Gulf Coast is still running every hour of every day. What changes is the political salience of that dependency, the degree to which decision-makers in Washington feel its weight when they sit down across from Mark Carney's negotiating team. When gas costs $4.51, they feel it. When it drops to $3.50, it becomes a line in a briefing document again. So here is the question for you to consider this Memorial Day weekend. Trump launched a war against Iran, accidentally handed Canada the energy leverage Ottawa had spent years trying to build, and is now personally negotiating the deal that removes that leverage, all while the USMCA clock ticks toward July 1st. Whether that is deliberate strategy or compressed coincidence is something historians will debate. Whether Canadian steelworkers, forestry workers, and auto workers see any tariff relief before the deadline is a question that will be answered in the next 37 days. If you think Trump timed the Iran deal to neutralize Canada's hand before the USMCA review, or if you think the peace talks are only about gas prices and midterms, leave that below. Both clocks are running, and they will converge before this summer ends.